Welcome to the Homeschool High School podcast, brought to you by Seven Sisters Homeschool.com and the Ultimate Homeschool Podcast Network. I'm Vicki, and I am here all by myself today to talk about one of my favorite topics, and that is poetry. So I just happen to love poetry, and I think it's great for teens to learn to love poetry. So that may sound kind of silly, but really, I'm going to give you some reasons why it is good for teens to have experiences with poetry in their homeschool high school as part of their English language arts credits. So, for real. So, here's some ideas. All right. So, poetry is a way of communicating that uses words richly. So in normal life, we communicate in sentences, beginning, middle, and end, subject and verb. In poetry, we communicate with words and imagery, and the sentence structure may or may not be there. It's a whole different way of communicating. So the reason why this is good is for students who learn to read and maybe memorize and write some poetry, they will actually experience improvement in their speaking and writing. It also, for teens who learn to think and speak a little bit more poetically, that can improve their writing, especially in those who go to college. So I'll give you an example of that. So poetry improving writing. Poetry gives you better ways of using words. And so if you think about it, especially teens at undergrad level, freshman composition, these teachers who read the early college papers and then a lot of papers all the way through college. You think all the English and history and science papers these young people are going to write. These teachers read hundreds of papers all the time, and a lot of them are excruciatingly boring. So if you have a teen that just happens to know it helps to alliterate a little bit here or there, or maybe use a larger word or a more image bearing word, it's not necessary, but it makes the reader's life, that teacher's life, so much better. And in the subjective points of life, it might just help a grade. So hold that in the back of your mind. Okay. All right. Well, and while we're at it, another reason for learning about poetry, reading and writing it, is poetry can be a tool for emotional health and healing. Not kidding. Um, Sometimes in mental health training, I have one of my hats is I'm a licensed professional counselor, and sometimes for younger people in particular, it is really nice to have a journal where you can write your own poetry and nobody's going to grade it, but you can capture thoughts and feelings and ideas in words that are outside of I'm writing a paper here. And it is actually very therapeutic for emotional health and healing to do that. Greeks, way back at the ancient Greek physician Soranus, believed that poetry was part of the healing process. And even the Bible has healing type poetry, if you think about it. So the Psalms of Lament are a way of lamenting, which is very therapeutic. So Psalm 130, Psalm 6, Psalm 38, Psalm 10, Psalm 40, Psalm 43, the Book of Lamentations, all of those have a poetic feel. Even the minor prophet Nahum, if you read it, it is written in a poetic style. So, God obviously likes poetry, and so it shows up in healing kind of ways. And it also shows up in praise kind of way. So learning about poetry and writing poetry is a biblical thing. And if we want to praise God, it's a good practice to write a psalm of praise. And the cool thing about it is, if you're writing a psalm of praise, you do it out of your heart, not, for, okay, now we have to follow a rubric for that. So it gives teens some latitude for creativity and just enjoying it. So, yes, poetry is a useful thing. Um, one of the things I really appreciate, though, about poetry is the improvement in vocabulary. So teens who read poetry, and especially if they memorize it, it really, really does help improve their vocabulary. And what we're finding is that the better vocabulary a person has, the better they're able to think problem solving, forward thinking, healthy life living kind of thoughts, that we need words to hang ideas on. And so, poetry can help build that vocabulary. Also, you can just have fun with poetry. If you read a limerick, that's a poem. If you read a silly poem, that's a poem. If you write a silly poem, that's a poem. And it can just help you lighten up and just have fun. So poetry's got a lot of benefits. It's Seven Sisters. With our kids, we made sure that every year of their high school, part of their credit in English language arts was writing poetry and reading some poetry. So often in the writing of the poetry, the reading poetry would be integrated in. So they didn't have to read a whole book of poetry unless they wanted to, but it would be integrated in, and they would do some poetry writing every year. And you will notice in our ELA bundles, in the writing component, they will have short story writing, research paper writing, essay writing, and poetry writing, because we know how good it is for the teens. So it is a useful thing for teens. Okay. A few years ago, I had a group of teens, after doing, the poetry components in their English language arts for a couple of years. They came to me about junior year and they said, you know what, next year we want a full credit, like an English language arts elective credit in poetry. And we want to do this together. So we created a class for them where they could earn a full credit in poetry. And so I will put links in the show notes, because I included an article at Seven Sisters Home School on how to do that. But what we did is, the baseline for that is, we took all of the poetry material that we had available at Seven Sisters and made that the skeleton, the framework of the course, and then built around that. So teens learned the writing skills of poetry. So we have introductory guide to poetry writing, intermediate guide to poetry writing, and advanced guide to poetry writing. And those take them from couplets all the way to more advanced writing. They do a little in-depth look at British poetry, not exhaustive, but just really exploring some traditional classic poetry from Britain. They read the book, Old Possum's Book of Practical Cats, which is one of my favorite books of all times. If you've never read that, it is awesome, and did the study guide for that to really explore the richness of that fun poetry. They also did Seven Sisters American Poetry Reading and Writing, where we went through classic cultures in America, so Native American and African American, and traditional kinds of poetry, read some examples, and then did some writing in those styles to try on different hats. Did the same with world poetry. So Seven Sisters World Poetry Guide, where they learned some cultures, different writing. I mean, you can't do every single country, but they did some poetry from Japan, some from Korea, from the South Africa. So they learned different parts of the world, and did some poetry writing in those styles. And then they did some poetry analysis. And we saved that to later in the year because a lot of ELA programs, they introduce a lot of poetry analysis, like in depth, pick it apart, and it kills the fun of the poetry. So we save that for last because the skills of poetry analysis are fun if you already love poetry. But if you're having to pick things apart and take the joy out of poetry too early in the process, in my opinion, that's not as much fun. So they did poetry analysis later on and just did little bits of it earlier in the year in the other guides. So just very, very basic things early on. All right. So what they did then is our teens did memorization of some poetry, and I will put links to some music videos of poems, and the teens can use to help them memorize poetry, because memorizing poetry is another marvelous way to get the rhythms and vocabulary of poetry. Then every week they did fun things like we would do a word wall, and they would all share words that had jumped out to them in the poetry that they had read during the week. We worked really hard on inspiring each other. So they would write a simple poem every week and share with each other, not for critique, because we weren't looking for, turning them into great poets at this phase. They're just to enjoy each other's writing and inspire each other. So they would share each other's poetry and learn to enjoy it. And they would then memorize and share some poems with each other, by recitation. So if that sounds like something that would be interesting to your teens, I will put links in the show notes too. It's a free syllabus. It's there on the website where it says step-by-step how to get those teens an English language arts elective credit, or if they want to make it a poetry topic, full credit with enough books and research papers and everything, some ideas for how to make that happen too. All right, so your teens can love poetry. I want them to feel the empowerment of learning, of memorizing, and then to have the empowerment of creating poetry. Not that they need to be great poets, but if they work through the Seven Sisters literature study guides and writing guides, what they do is have enough writing experiences, starting with very basic couplets. They will build their confidence in using words and then can write poetry as is on their hearts. And they can carry that life skill all the way into life as far as they want to go. Or they can take bits and pieces out of it and throw it in life. If you're writing a letter, to drop a line of poetry. If you're writing a research paper in college, to alliterate a little bit. Or if you're reading classic fun books, like one of the books that we always encourage our teens at some point to read is P.G. Wodehouse's Right Ho Jeeves, and we have a study guide for that. His Silly Jeeves and Wooster's books are riddled with phrases from poetry. And if they have, read those poems, or they go like, I am reading this thing and I'm catching a line of poetry, then they look that up, what poem is that from? It adds the awareness of poetry, adds to the richness of their literature experiences, especially like with Woodhouse. So there's so much for teens out of that. I'll just share one simple experience. I had one young man who did not like to write. And when he got to the poetry section in his first high school class, and we were just doing the introduction to writing poetry. And so we started out with couplets. And couplets are just 2 lines of poetry, and they rhyme at the end. And when he wrote those, he realized that he could do it. And he commented to me, he said, I didn't think I could do poetry, but I did this couplet. And it increased his confidence, and he kept leaning into that. And by the end of the school year, he was churning out poetry with all the rest of them. Now, he did not need to grow up and be a great poet, but he had more confidence with his words and communicating. And he grew up to be a firefighter, is what he did. But he's a well versed firefighter, and that makes the world bigger and better for him. So, if you've got teens who love communicating and want more richness, if you've got a creative teen, if you've got a teen who's stressed and needs some anxiety support, poetry is great for that. If you've got a teen who wants to just build and feel a little more confident in their writing, poetry is good for that. So go over to Seven Sisters Homeschool and take a look at the poetry articles. We got uh, like probably 50 blog posts on different ways of looking at poetry and our writing guides. So you will have a good time, you and your teens. So that is it for today. Thank you to Seth Tillman for editing. Thank you all for joining us, and we will see you next week at the Homeschool High School Podcast, brought to you by 7sistershomeschool.com and the Ultimate Homeschool Podcast Network.